Renthal street, chain, and sprockets are perfectly matched for maximum power transfer and efficiency. From racetrack to daily rider, with over 800 fitments, Renthal Street has a final drive solution for almost any bike. Use renthal.com to find the correct fitment.
Hello again. Welcome to another Paddock Pass podcast, and one I'm delighted to say will again revolve around some MotoGP racing. With a spring break of the 2023 calendar now in the hangover stage and the Gran Premio d'Italia Oakley next on the agenda. We've got some opinions on the Grand Prix coming up and also a special Renthal Street Sessions interview with Matthew Roberts, former BBC presenter and commentator and now the author of books with people such as Casey Stoner, Jorge Lorenzo and John Hopkins. He's also doing stuff on the Isle of Man, a former World Superbike presenter with Eurosport up until this year, I believe, and now focused on British Superbikes. So Matt's been in racing a long time, well over 20 years, and got some good stories and some good insight and some good information. The Paddock Pass podcast comes to you thanks to Renthal Street. Cheers, guys, and a plea for anyone looking to upgrade components on their motorcycle, head to renthal.com. My name is Adam Wheeler, and I'm pleased to be joined by the immense David Emmett and the moribund Neil Morrison. Steve English is attempting the Herculean task of switching from World Superbike in Misano to the meat of TT racing, so hopefully he and Gordo will get time for a Superbike show. But in the MotoGP meantime, you're stuck with us. Guys, Mugello. Ducati have won 4 times in the last 5 years. Dave, can anyone beat them?
It's an interesting question because obviously Ducati, Mugello used to be their test track. I mean, they used to do a lot of testing there, and they still do a little bit of testing there, but more with superbikes rather than MotoGP bikes. Now they tend to spend more time in Misano. The thing about Mugello is it's a really flowing track. I mean, it is sort of Mugello, Phillip Island are the two greatest tracks on earth. I would put Assen and Silverstone just one step below them, but still, absolute Premier League classes. But Mugello is just an absolutely perfect motorcycle racing track. That means that it's really flowing. All of the corners tend to come. There's no, first gear corners. It's all second, third gear corners. You're coming off. You're carrying speed through corners and accelerating. So even though I think it's the fastest. It's still the fastest track on the calendar. Though I think Qatar occasionally will sort of like bump the edge of it. We'll battle for that title, but it's a place where speeds keep on increasing, but it's going to be interesting to see. I think Aprilia, really we've got to see what Aprilia can do. If there's a place where Aleix Espargaro and Maverick Vinales could challenge the Ducatis, I think it's definitely there, and also Assen. And I wouldn't write off Yamaha, even though it's a very difficult bike. The one thing where the one disadvantage which the Yamaha really has is this acceleration out of slow corners, which is just terrible. There are no slow corners. It's all places where you can carry loads of corner speed and accelerate through there. So I think it really negates the weakness of the Yamaha. And I think Fabio Quartararo, he probably realizes this is a track where he can make a result, and he's really going to be going out to try to score, to do something.
Dave, I'd say, we've been away from MotoGP for 3 weeks and you're going mad, but there is actually some foundation in your estimations, because Pecco Bagnaia won last year's Grand Prix by 0.6 from Fabio Quartararo. And Neil, of course, the Frenchman won in his World Championship year at Mugello. Yamaha also have a pretty decent record. Jorge Lorenzo took back-to-back wins a few years ago, so it's not beyond the absurd, even though they're having a terrible season like we kind of summed up in our Patreon show about the surprises of 2023 so far, that Yamaha actually have a half-decent showing around the fantastic Italian circuit.
Exactly. We did say that before Jerez. Fabio Quartararo, that is basically his territory. He had only qualified on pole position or second in previous years, but was unable to, I think, get into Q2 on that particular occasion. So I think qualifying could be key to his to his challenge this weekend. Fabio also spoke at Le Mans how basically they're not going to be going through different setups throughout the rest of this year. They're going to go back to their 2021 setting and basically try and stick with that and get the best out of that. So let's see how that approach works. This will be the first weekend where maybe they'll not be turning the bike upside down, trying to get lots of different things from the bike, and it could be a bit more settled, and that could well suit Fabio. So yeah, if there is one track on the calendar where he could make a comeback, it's probably here. Maybe Jerez or Catalunya, alongside Mugello, probably his and Yamaha's strongest tracks. So, yeah, I think that's one of the big stories going into this weekend. Really excited to see whether he can get back, because his ride at Mugello last year, I think, is arguably the best that he ever produced, because, he was nowhere in qualifying and produced a kind of Herculean fight back from the third row, I think, in the race, despite being consistently outgunned by the Ducatis on the main straight. Did some fantastic riding through the twisty bits. So, if that Quartararo is kind of here in the coming days, then maybe he can be at the sharp end, as well as a host of Ducatis.
Speaking of comebacks, we know that Pol Espargaro will not be joining the MotoGP grid just yet. A press release issued by Gas saying that the Catalan was close, but not close enough. Possibly we could see him in Germany. Of course, now MotoGP is entering a triple back-to-back stint of races. So let's see if Gas can finally be back to full strength for that round. So Jonas Folger steps in. No word as of yet on Miguel Oliveira for the RNF Aprilia team. But Enea Bastianini should be coming back in. But we were just saying before we recorded, Neil, that Bastianini's record in Mugello is not particularly shining. I think a fifth place is the best he's taken in Moto3, 6-7 years ago. So even though Bastianini's back in the pack and obviously has the best motorcycle on the grid at his disposal, there's no kind of indication that he's really going to be upsetting, the fight for podium contention. Dave, also, speaking of riders, just before we get on to one of the other talking points about Mugello, which is the amount of public that would turn up, it's also a phase of the calendar where contracts or discussions about the future of riders could maybe get a little bit more intense.
Yeah, I mean, traditionally, Mugello is where contracts discussions start in earnest. The teams don't like to, or certainly the factories, they don't like to start talking too early, because the flyaways, or the American races, Argentina and Austin, are generally so sort of strange that it's difficult to really draw conclusions from it. I mean, the fact that Alex Rins won in Texas, and then, really struggled at Jerez and Le Mans, that sort of tells you a lot about it. So yes, I think it's the opening phase of contracts there. We're likely to see a very intense series of negotiations from now until from Mugello, Sachsenring, and then maybe we might get a contract signed, a contract or two signed at Assen. We might have to wait until the summer break, but I think there's things to do. Obviously, the big question is, does Franco Morbidelli stay or does he go? Who replaces him? Does Tony Arbolino get a seat in Ducati somewhere? What happens with Pedro Acosta? And now I think to me the Pedro Acosta decision is much more of will be a longer term thing. I'd expect to see that signed in Austria for a lot of really obvious reasons, because maybe where do KTM put him? Where do they slot him in? I think there's still a lot to open, but there's one or two. I think here is where we will start to hear the first real rumours.
Neil, two questions for you. Is there a Grand Prix where you sleep any closer to the circuit than Mugello, knowing that I think you could actually walk in to this particular event? And secondly, how excited are you to see Andrea Dovizioso be coronated as a MotoGP legend on Thursday?
1 year I stayed in a place next to the Sachsenring where from my bedroom window I could see, I think, turn 9. But on a regular basis, this is definitely, that was in 2021 when no fans were allowed in. So that was a sort of a special year. So this is probably the closest. I would say you could probably walk from our villa to the track in about half an hour. And it's really it's a fabulous setting. It is really, really nice. Probably the closest of the year. And regarding Dovizioso being crowned MotoGP legend, I mean, that's going to be the crowning moment of my year. I think it's there aren't many better things to see.
He's always been a legend in Neil's heart, that's for sure.
Why is it taking so long for him to be inducted into the Hall of Fame? That's what I ask.
But not a MotoGP world champion. That drags up the old subject. Should you be a Premier Class world champion to be included in this? Yeah,
but they've kind of got to the stage that there's so many legends now that all the former champions have already been inducted into the Hall of Fame. So they're sort of fast running out of names to convert. They need to have at least 2 each year, I think. So it's looking down at guys with 3 or 4 second places in the championship now.
I actually want to talk to Andrea about another subject, because there's some rumours that a round or two of MXGP this year will be changed. And Faenza, which has been, an Italian replacement venue in the last couple of years, has now been bought by Andrea Dovizioso, and he's turned it into something of a motocross kind of sport park. So it's in the transformative stages. I want to ask him if he's actually considered running a Grand Prix. So talk about going from MotoGP icon to legend to motocross power broker. It's quite a transition.
It was always very funny in the Ducati hospitality whenever you were at a race, because normally Dovizioso said, he just couldn't get out of there fast enough to avoid talking to us. But as soon as you were there, he was sort of like straight over, and he buttonholing you and asking you everything possible about MXGP. It's clear that he only really went road racing to fund his his motocross career. So it wouldn't surprise me if he had bought Faenza.
Yeah, it's actually quite in the know, is Andrea. He told me some gossip once, which I didn't know, and I thought, right, okay, I better dig around, and he was right. So, but yeah, it'd be good to see Dovey back in the paddock. Guys, there's one other subject. We're considering doing a live show for the British Grand Prix at Silverstone on the first week of August. So tell us, is this a good idea or not? Would you come out? Would you listen to us? We'll have some kind of trivia going on. We'll dig up some subjects, some proper bench racing. Write to us on Twitter at Paddock Pass Pod, or drop us a line on Patreon. And speaking of Patreon, we'll be back on duty with the Note Show in Mugello. We want to know, if you want to know rather, what riders have said and what's going on from the circuit on a daily basis, then sign up and get that special content. One of the things we'll be looking out for in particular, Dave, is how many people come through the gate. We're firmly into the post-Valentino Rossi period now in MotoGP. If you're an Italian fan, honestly, it couldn't be better. Italian world champion, Italian manufacturer, dominating proceedings. You put a post recently on Twitter, I think, where you highlighted the prices for the weekend. And while we had been praising Le Mans' value for money, Mugello still seemed pretty pricey for a weekend ticket. Thankfully, there's no clashes with the likes of Formula One. I mean, they've done their signature events. Kind of Barcelona GP was very popular, Monaco, of course. So hopefully, we might see a bigger gate in Mugello this year. I think that's going to be one of the big kind of narratives, isn't it, from this Grand Prix?
Yeah, definitely. I remember last year. Normally when you driving into Mugello is a question of trying not to run over as many people as possible, and sometimes actively trying to run them over because they're being really annoying. But there's usually massive traffic jams. There's usually huge crowds, especially huge crowds going down this one narrow little country lane towards which heads towards the entrance. And I just sailed through last year. I was genuinely astonished at how empty it was, and it did look a little bit sad. But I mean, we've talked about this before, that Mugello is sandwiched in between 3 of the biggest events of the year, with Le Mans, Sachsenring and Assen, where there's so much going on, there's so much entertainment all the time. And Mugello, apart from the racing, there's not a great deal going on. I think they're trying to put on a few more entertainments. There's going to be sort of like a DJ playing after the race on Sunday for half an hour. There's going to be a few other bits and bobs, but I am genuinely intrigued to see whether Mugello can start to, whether the crowds will be a little bit larger, whether they'll start to come back, because I always thought that it would be, speed which killed the Mugello. The fact that the bikes are getting faster and there's just sort of not enough room for them to go at those speeds. But if we keep getting crowds of sort of, between 30 and 40,000, then the race itself stops being sustainable.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, we also shouldn't forget that while perhaps the majority of Italy couldn't give a toss, Neil, this actually comes round to you, because this will be a Mugello weekend where you won't have to worry about a Champions League final and all the stresses that come with it. That's not to pick anything at Liverpool, by the way, and their kind of mediocre Premier League campaign this year. But, Inter Milan are playing against Manchester City. I mean, it could be another thing that deters potential fans from camping out on Mugello for the weekend. But like we say, it's a minor thing. We just hope that, people embrace, the force that is Ducati at the moment, and the spectacle that is Mugello. And, the prices of the tickets don't turn out to be such an inhibitive kind of factor when it comes to enjoying another Grand Prix weekend. And the fact that it's coming after a bit of a break for MotoGP, perhaps it will inspire people to actually get on their bike or on their car or, grab a tent and actually camp out for the weekend. But, regardless of which, we're hoping Mugello will be a strong Grand Prix before going to the Sachsenring and also Assen. 3 fantastic tracks, Dave. I mean, talk about the differences in, riding demands between all 3 of them.
Yeah, I mean, like I say, I think Assen and Mugello are sort of similar in the way that they are fast and flowing tracks. Sachsenring is another track, completely different. It's very, very tight, but again, you're spending so much time on the side of the tire. That's what makes the Sachsenring so interesting, also as well. So yeah, I mean, it's very different. Certainly, very different from the kind of stop and go that we had at Le Mans. And 3 very important, and it's going to be very important also just to survive these next 3 races with the sprint races on the Saturday. If you get injured at Mugello, then you stand to lose an awful lot of points.
One thing that could be a bit of a red herring, or something that could shake results up, is I saw some weather forecasts for the weekend ahead, and it's looking, initially that we could have some heavy rain on both Saturday and Sunday. So I think weather played its part in qualifying last year. We had Fabio Di Giannantonio on the front row on pole position in a kind of crazy, slightly wet then dry qualifying session. And yeah, you wonder whether that could shake things up again. Because it's a scary place in the dry, but in the wet as well, it could be really scary. And also, I think I'm going to be holding my breath most of all this weekend, because the sprint, we know it's had some pretty hairy encounters so far this year, but imagining just the kind of craziness that we might see going into San Donato on the first lap or the second lap or the third lap of the sprint, I think that could be quite hair-raising. So yeah, I think I'm just hoping for a kind of safe weekend more than going into any other MotoGP round this year. I think, Mugello, you hope, will pass without incident.
Guys, we're going to go for a quick break, but when we come back, we're going straight into the interview with Matt. It was pretty interesting, wasn't it? We haven't had him on the podcast before, but like we say, a guy who was a journalist turned into a presenter, is an author as well. He had some nice stories, but like we mentioned, also had some interesting opinions on the state of play when it comes to British riders, and also that kind of transition from, say, Superbike or from Moto2, Moto3 into the Premier class.
Yeah, I found it really interesting, the stuff that he was saying about the difficulty that people face switching between series. What makes it so difficult to succeed in MotoGP if you're not going through the entire the entire FIM Junior, is it the FIM Junior Championship? And that,
Junior GP.
Yeah, Junior GP, Red Bull Rookies, that sort of route. What the alternative routes are, all the rest of it. That was particularly interesting. And, Matt's a fun and funny guy.
Renthal fat bars are synonymous with off-road world champions. The Renthal Street Fat Bar draws from decades of experience to create the ultimate 28mm handlebar in a range of street-specific bends. Whether you're looking to alter the height, width, rise, or sweep of your handlebar, Renthal Street handlebars offer a bend to suit your requirements. Use the WorksFit handlebar comparison tool at renthal.com to find the perfect bend.
That's all from us. So thanks for listening. Thanks to Renthal and more from Italy. And here's our chat with Matthew Roberts. See you next time. Math, good to have you with us. You're on the Isle of Man. What's going on there? What's the crack?
Oh, not a lot. Nothing really happening here, mate. No, it's really quiet.
Sport tourism. Perhaps they'll hold a trophy to for the tourism.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's the annual tourist championship, the tourist trophy. Yeah, the TT. So I'm here for 2 weeks. I've already been here. I forget what day it is now. Yeah, I've been here for 5 days already, and just about another week or so to go. But we're more or less done with practice week. It's been really good. The weather's been absolutely mega. It's been unbelievable. We've had probably the best conditions, well, certainly in a long time, but I mean, I can't imagine them ever being any better than what they've had. It's been really warm, really still. Touch wood so far, it's been relatively without incident, and the pace is really hot, and the island is busy, and when it's like this, it's a really good place to be.
I mean, you know, you've kept sort of contact or touch with MotoGP. I mean, how many years did you actually work in the championship, mate? I can't remember. I mean, it must have been, what, like 15 or so?
Me and you both had black hair, Adam, when we started. Do you remember?
We did. Well, I think I was going grey before you, though, mate. That was for sure. But of course, like, you transitioned into World Superbike. You were the face of MotoGP on the BBC, World Superbike, British Superbike, the Isle of Man, like you say. I mean, your face has been pretty much everywhere. But just give us a bit of history, you know, with MotoGP initially, because that's the orientation for this podcast. You know, you were based, obviously, we met each other, you know, good friends when we were working for Dorna. I think we were the first British guys. And then, of course, joined by Gavin Emmett, who's now sort of BT Sports main guy. It's been a long old road, isn't it?
Yeah, it has. And when you say it like that, I never, ever for 1 minute imagined that this is how it would have turned out, you know, and we went over there in those very early days to Dorna as effectively, like you said, we were the first British people there. Funnily enough, there was a British kind of contingent before us of camera operatives and production staff that was Greenlight TV, which now produces the Isle of Man TT. So when I'm at the Greenlight offices, when I'm over here, see all these signed photographs on the wall of Wayne Rainey and Kevin Schwantz and all those guys, and remembering those days when they were doing it. So it's quite funny because that was the overlap there when Donna decided to take everything in-house, and then they needed some English presence in there to write the press releases, as you remember, Adam, the website, do some general translating and stuff like that. And I'd done my degree in Spanish and media studies, so I think that's what gave me the edge over you in that first job interview, mate. But you were like a month or so behind me, weren't you, when they realised that they needed somebody a bit more qualified on motorcycles, I think. Because I didn't know the first thing.
Yeah, if you remember sort of MotoGP.com back in the first days, I mean, it was such a rudimentary website with just us writing text and stories, and now it's this kind of monolith of video and all sorts of content and whatever else. So it's been, it's remarkable to see the change in it. But I mean, you quickly transitioned out of, you know, writing stories to presenting, and, you know, the BBC gig was a big thing, wasn't it? Because talking about the wider picture, it was, you know, the last time MotoGP was on free to air, you know, it was a large audience, a large platform for the sport, especially in the UK.
Yeah, that's right. And I think sometimes I've probably talked about it before, and I looked back and thought it was kind of a strange story that I made that progression. But it also really it wasn't, because when I was at uni in my final year, I did some video stuff. I really enjoyed being on camera. And if you remember, before I actually started with Dorna, I did this crazy TV show in the UK where I travelled from San Francisco down to Buenos Aires. It was like a backwater cable station that I did this youth travel show on. So I'd presented to camera, albeit, you know, in a pretty rudimentary way before, and I'd really enjoyed that. So I think probably in the back of my mind, I was thinking about a career in television. And then when the BBC came in 2005, and I'd started doing world feed commentary with Nick Harris by that point, purely because there wasn't really anybody, you know, in the office. You were doing motocross by then, and I was kind of the person who was sort of in line to help Nick out, because obviously they were trying to save some money, and I was already there. So once I started doing the TV commentary, and then the BBC took that when they started to dip their toe into it, I could sort of see, hang on, there's a potential opportunity if I play my cards right and ride this wave for a little bit, that I could end up getting into the BBC maybe and doing some TV work. So I wouldn't say it was just like a happy coincidence that I was just rolling along and then it happened, because probably the reality when I actually think back to it was that I was quite determined that was what was going to happen. And yeah, and I pushed pretty hard for it in the end.
Was that the big break, if you like? Was that because, since then you've worked for Eurosport and done all sorts of other things, but that was what made the difference?
Yeah, definitely. Well, a couple of things about it. First of all, I have to say, Adam mentioned Gav there as well, and Gav came in shortly after me.
No relation, I would like to point out.
Yeah, he says that too, David. To be fair, point that out. Usually, when you raise your hand at a press conference, I think.
Yeah, exactly. He wants nothing to do with me at that point, which is fair enough. I reckon.
Whatever this is nothing to do with me. No, yeah, Gav and I had met at uni, and after Adam and myself had been at Dorna for a few months, our boss at the time, Paco, came in and he said to me, "Oh, we could do with another one." And I'd just been on holiday with Gav actually, on a lads holiday. And anyway, long story short, Gav came out and worked with us as well. And he was when the BBC first came in 2005. He did the pit lane reporting for them, and then he got offered a bit of a step up at Dorna actually, to become kind of our boss, which was a big move for him at the time. It meant he couldn't do the TV, and it was a big decision for him, and he decided to do it. So that opened up. That was my big break then, because I knew that with Gav doing that would give me the chance to step into his shoes with the BBC. And of course, when you're doing, you're going out on terrestrial TV in the UK, on BBC Two, they were getting an audience of between 1.1, 1.4 million viewers for MotoGP. And for the British Grand Prix, they'd gone to the main channel, BBC One, and get 3 million viewers just like that. Because that was the, viewing habits at the time, and still, to an extent to this day, people watch BBC One when they turn the TV on. So yeah, it kind of opened me up then to an audience and gave me a lot of credibility, because the BBC is so well established and well renowned around the world, for better or worse. Yeah, it was definitely a great chance for me to learn the ropes as well. I'm working with top professionals, both in front of the camera and behind it as well. So it was a really good education, and I was able to sort of go under the radar a little bit and do as little or as much as they wanted me to do in those early days, because Susie Perry was the presenter, and I'd chip in with some pre-recorded stuff and then the occasional live hit. And then 2007, after I'd been doing it for sort of 18 months or so, we were out in China and Susie got food poisoning, and it was only a short program, that one. It was about a 10-minute build-up before the race, live in 2007. And yeah, I say I had no choice. I think they had no choice but to just shove me in front of the camera and see what happened. And I just about got away with that one, and then got a few more opportunities, and it went from there. So yeah, 100%, David. And I think when effectively what happened was the rights ran out for the BBC, and they didn't manage to retain them at the end of 2013. By which time I'd had a good crack at the whip, and the opportunity came then to go to Eurosport, but that wouldn't have come about if it wasn't for the BBC thing, for sure. So yeah, it was a big turning point.
Matt, can you talk a little bit about how MotoGP was at that time? Obviously, I guess it was peak sort of Rossi mania, sort of mid-2000s, and you had a lot of characters racing in the paddock at that time. I don't know, think of the likes of Biaggi or Colin Edwards or Troy Bayliss, I guess. You had a lot of characters basically that could give you, I guess, good interviews, good clips. I mean, how was that for you?
Yeah, it was intimidating at first, Neil, to be honest. And I think now I see all the content that goes out now on main channels, on MotoGP.com, and on all the individual team socials and stuff. And the riders' understanding of what's expected of them from a media point of view has completely changed. And that was probably I would say the big difference. When I went in there, I didn't really know what to do or how to approach these guys. And a lot of them were, either they were quite aloof, or I perceived them to be quite aloof and difficult to approach. And some of them would be working with media officers that were just as difficult, to be honest with you. So, It was
Still the case.
still the case. Yeah, I know. Oh, that's a bit of a bugbear of mine, to be honest. There are some really good press officers out there, but there are some that fundamentally misunderstand their role, which is to facilitate the rider's relationship with the media, and they think it's their role to get in the way of that. But anyway, that's just a little bugbear. Get that off my chest. So yeah, it was really different. So you'd have to, 9 times out of 10, you'd be approaching the rider directly to get stuff. And where are you going to do that? It's either while they're having their lunch in the hospitality unit where they don't want to speak to you, or you're going and tapping on the motorhome door, which takes some balls. And I probably didn't have that at the time. So probably a missed opportunity in a way when I think back at what I perhaps could have been doing and creating. But I think it's different now. But you imagine going up to Kenny Roberts Jr. and knocking on his motorhome door, and he doesn't know who you are, and you're in a Dorna uniform. You can imagine you'd have got short shrift.
It's interesting you're talking about professionalization, because the professionalization has been throughout all of the sport, really. Are you seeing that the same in World Superbikes, in BSB, in the TT, or are there still, if you like, natural characters who unpolished people, who haven't been through the PR preparation mill?
Yeah, 100%. First of all, BSBs and especially the TT, the guys are so approachable, and they're the ones who are really at that stage of their career, especially in BSB, where they really want to push themselves on, and they know that either they're being paid, in BSB, a lot of guys aren't drawing a wage from a team; they're drawing wages from personal sponsors, and if they don't get themselves on the TV, then that's not good for their personal sponsors. So there's just a basic relationship there, basic dynamic going on that makes them more approachable and more willing to speak, I suppose. And perhaps the more you move up and you go into MotoGP and they get on big salaries from the teams, and it's not my fault, I don't really need to speak to you, it's down to whatever the team decides. So that all changes. So does that make them better people, more humble people, more approachable? I'm not sure. Maybe it's just the situation that they're in, there's probably a lot of that. But it's quite refreshing coming from MotoGP to go and work in BSB and know that these guys, let's say, for example, you get a red flag during a live broadcast situation and you're trying to fill time. That was always getting harder and harder to do in MotoGP because you've got to go through a press officer every time. In BSB, we get a red flag. All you need to do is walk down pit lane and people are stepping out of their pit garages to talk to you, literally. So that makes the job a lot easier in that respect.
Dave asked you about sort of characters and dealing with riders at the time, Matt. And one of the reasons why you and I don't talk so much is because, frustratingly, you're as good a writer as you are a presenter. So, I think your skills on the page are up there, mate. I mean, and that's been, borne out by your sort of sideline as an author. I mean, working with Casey Stoner, Jorge Lorenzo, John Hopkins, just to name a couple. And production of those books. Tell us a couple of stories, because I can remember you driving a particularly luxurious car given to you by Alberto Puig that was kind of, passed around the Stoner family. And you had a good friendship with Casey and the likes of Chaz Davies. And, that led on to, a close relationship and ultimately a book and I guess a friendship that lasts to this day.
Yeah. Nice memories, actually. Don't stop to think about that stuff too often these days. But yeah, I remember the first time I met Casey, because obviously they came over, Charles and Casey were part of that Movistar project with Dorna and Alberto. So you'd see them a couple of times kicking around the Dorna offices, coming in to sign a contract or whatever they were doing. And I remember Tony Calvo, who was in charge of all of that for Dorna, taking Casey and Colin over to, do you remember the supermarket across from Dorna, Esclat, where they do the Menu del Dia? And we'd often have lunch over there. And I ended up sitting with Casey and his dad. This is before I'd even rode a Grand Prix, Maybe they'd done a wild card, I think, in 2001. I think the wild card had it.
Well, just to mention to listeners as well, Tony Calvo now runs the Honda Asia team. So he's kind of looking after Chantra and Ayagura. So he's still very much sort of implicit in MotoGP still.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Lovely guy, Tony, really nice fella. And he's been involved in that youth sort of development stuff for that's how long he's been around. So they were kind of, the Stoners and then Chaz a little bit at the GPs, but the Stoners in Spain when they first landed, everybody knows that story of, they didn't have a lot. They were moving around a fair bit, and I think I just felt age-wise sort of in the middle a little bit of Casey and his dad, so I could sort of relate to both of them, and had lunch with them that day in the supermarket, and then we just hung out with them a little bit between races. We went to watch the motocross at Belpudge, did various things, went go-karting. They came to our house in Sitges where I was living and stuff like that. And yeah, the car thing was, Alberto had given them this old Citroen BX. And when I say old, it's funny, isn't it now? Like, old cars, a 10-year-old car now looks almost brand new, but 20 years ago, a 10-year-old car was rotten and hanging on. And that's what this old Citroen was, big red Citroen BX. And Alberto had given it to the Stoners to drive around in, but he'd never actually signed it over to them because they didn't have a residency in Spain. So then Colin says to me, "Hey, Matt, I'm thinking of buying a little Cinquecento Fiat to put in a trailer on the back of the motorhome, but I can't register it over here. If I register it in your name, you can have the Citroen." And I didn't have €2 to rub together at the time anyway. I didn't have a car. Let's be honest, donor wages at that time weren't great. I don't know if that's changed, but we were pretty low down the pecking order. So I was like, yeah, great. So that's how that happened. I put the Cinquecento in my name, which caused a few issues further down the line when it got abandoned somewhere in Europe. And then I inherited the Citroen. But that car only lasted. I remember that car lasted about a year, and then something went on it. The gearbox went or something, and I took it to the garage, and the guy was like, "Oh, this is pretty unfixable. You're better off just trashing it." So I trashed it, and then I told Alberto, I was like, "Oh, funny story. That Citroen BX. It's gone to and it had been in his family since it was brand new. So it's gone to the scrapyard." And he looked at me, like how he does with this proper serious face. He went, "There was nothing wrong with that." I was like, "Oh, okay." Just not the first time stepped away from the conversation with Alberto.
I can remember a time he went karting with Casey, and he was ridiculously quick, even slightly on four wheels. And I remember you and I at the time were saying, "Yeah, it's only because he's got a few kilos less than us. Don't worry, that's just what it's got to be down to." I mean, you couldn't have known then how good he would be and sort of how he would become one of the aliens of MotoGP. When it came to sort of writing the book and then moving on to writing other riders' books, I mean, how was that process for you? Was it tougher? Was it, or was it something that fell to you quite naturally?
With the Casey one, I was quite invested in the story anyway, because like we said, I knew them and I knew him to be very different to what the public perception of him was. And I suppose it was a personal mission in a way to change that, or at least to give him a voice. And I think with him, there were two things that people didn't really understand about him. One was, why was he so fast? And two, why did he retire so early? And I thought, if I can capture his true character and answer those two questions in the book, really, then that will be worth reading, and that will get people's attention or make them want to read it. And the two things essentially went hand in hand, because why was he so fast? Because he was riding, doing nothing but riding from, as soon as he could walk, doing all different kinds of riding, doing purposeful practice like every day, hours and hours of different types of riding. He was incentivized from a young age to go fast, and had a completely different upbringing to probably anyone else in the world, and that made him completely different. And also it made him burn out much more quickly too. So the answer to both questions was essentially the same one, but through that we were able to kind of chart his whole story from his earliest days to the end of his career. And of course, whenever any of us look back, we remember things in our own way, through our own lens, and it might not be totally accurate. And there were certain things that his parents remembered and Casey remembered a little bit differently, and that was a challenge, to be fair. But hopefully in the end we did it justice. It went through a lot of rounds of scrutiny anyway, so yeah. You can imagine.
That era of MotoGP, Matt, I mean, when Casey was riding, you had him, Jorge, Danny, Valentino, and I guess those were the four main guys. And it's quite different to how MotoGP looks nowadays, where you have just I don't know, 10, 11 guys sometimes fighting for the podium at a single race. I mean, from your point of view, maybe we don't have the outright superstars that we had, when you were working in the championship at the BBC. But maybe we have a bit more variety now. I mean, what's your kind of view on that? Do you think MotoGP's in a better place now, or do you think it's still, it lacks a little bit of that star power that was evident, I think, when you were, working for the BBC?
It's so difficult to answer that question, but I do think it suffers a little bit. Mind you saying that, the minute Pecco, last year was so dominant, really, wasn't he? Although, like you said, on their day, almost anybody in the grid can win a race. I suppose that's good. I think the previous year, when you're literally turning up to a track and you've got no idea who's going to win, because all the riders are on such a similar level, all the bikes are on such a similar level, and it all comes down to how well does a bike or a tyre combination or bike and tyre relationship work at a particular track. And in the end, that's taken away from the individualism of the rider, isn't it? So, I think it probably has lost something in that respect. And also, the other thing that I see from the outside now when I look at it, Neil, is we're talking before about Casey's upbringing being different to anybody else's, and so was Jorge Lorenzo's, and so was Danny Pedrosa's, and so was Ben Spee's. And because of that, you had different riding styles on track that were, and Valentino and Colin, you only have to look at them through two corners and you know which rider it is. I've only been to a handful of MotoGP rounds recently, but I remember being in Austria last year and watching out of the window and trackside thinking, I can't even tell the difference between these guys, because they've all had such a similar background. They've all come through Talent Cups and Moto3, Moto2 to MotoGP now, that the sort of established best practice of how to ride is really similar, and they don't have these ingrained habits from whether it's dirt track or mini bikes or whatever. So that was the other, I think, big pull of MotoGP back then, was you had guys with completely contrasting riding styles, all going very similar speeds, but doing it all in a different way, with a different view on life, with different upbringings, and that made it really, that gave it an extra something, I think. So it's a fine line, isn't it, between how do you get kids through from different countries? How did you give them the opportunities and create a more international grid and a more equal playing field without losing some of that personality? It's tricky, but I think you see it in a lot of professional sport. You see it in professional football, for example, in soccer. A lot of kids now come through academies, and they're kind of like identikit in it. But you get the odd maverick, but generally speaking.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess, you're obviously working in the BSP paddock. MotoGP at the moment is suffering from a kind of a dearth of British riders. We haven't had one in the class since, Cal retired full time at the end of 2020. Looking at the junior classes, I mean, there's some obviously young talents around. We've got some kids coming through the British Talent Cup, but I mean, do you see any kids currently in the British paddock that you can maybe see making it into GPs? I mean, how do you see that as a kind of production line?
Yeah, again, and that's an age-old problem, isn't it? That the kids who are coming through the British paddock now, if you don't move on quickly from the British Talent Cup into the Spanish system or European system, then it's going to be a big challenge to ever get there, like a huge challenge to ever get there. If MotoGP were looking more at World Superbike, maybe you'd see a bit of a route there. But I'll give you a couple of examples. So, like, Rory Skinner won the Talent Cup a couple of years ago. He's ended up in Moto2 now because he's always been good enough, but he didn't quite get the opportunities, or things didn't work out there. A kid called Max Cook won it a couple of years ago. Max ended up with no ride after the Talent Cup, or he went and did the talent team and it didn't happen. He's coming back now through Stock 6. He's now got a ride in Superbikes and he looks like he's got some talent. A kid called Franco Bourne, Geordie kid, did awesome, won the Talent Cup, disappeared for a bit. He's come back through Stock 6. He's now in Stock 1000 and 18. He's only 18, and he won the first round in Silverstone, and he looked mega on the bike, and all the guys who were riding with him, Dan Linfoot was riding with him, and said, this kid's got serious talent, but what's the path now for him? It's going to take him a couple of years to get to BSB level, and it might take him a couple of years to get to World Superbike level if he gets that chance. You've got Bradley Ray, who was last year's British Superbike champion. Brad Ray rode in Red Bull Rookies with Toprak Rascatiotlu, with Jorge Martin, and Joan Mir. He was in that. Yeah. And look what those guys are doing now. And, and Brad had to go and do CEV Moto2, Stock 6 stuff, Super Sport stuff. And in my opinion, had demonstrated that he had that talent. But, Kyle Ryde was in that age group too, but he didn't stand out as much. I mean, Brad went to Circuit of Americas, Texas, in the Red Bull and won by 10 seconds. Excuse me. Finished fourth in the championship and won one race by 10 seconds. Now, you can't tell me that that's not a kid with the talent to at least get a chance to go with those guys. But unfortunately, it's not really been available to British riders. Thankfully, I think that's changed now with Vision Track, putting the money in that they're doing now and supporting the British team. And I think in Casey O'Gorman, there's a talent there that's definitely got the potential to go. I mean, he's Irish. He's a little bit British because he's lived in the UK his whole life, but I think he's probably I would say right now you've got him in the Talent Cup and in the rookies, and then in the British paddock you're probably looking at, I think, Franco Bourne. If you want me to give you a name, it's someone who looks like he's got the ability to go places.
To build on that, leads me to two questions. The first is it really just down to money? The ability. Because there is a period in people's careers where they need to be able to fund their career. I think after Red Bull Rookies and into Moto3, especially in Moto3, and you need to have a couple of good years with a very strong team. And if you don't get picked up by one of the big teams, then you have to be able to, fund a ride in a good team. And the second one is the pathway for British riders much more through World Superbikes. Again, it was, traditionally, if we look at who dominated World Superbikes for, probably the past decade or so.
To go the GP route, if you like, and I know because I've done a little bit of work with a young rider over here and his family to try and help him get into that paddock. And this is a super talented young kid. And if you want to go to a top team and do the European Talent Cup, for example, that's going to cost you 80,000 euros. Just for the ride, that's a lot of money, obviously. Now, there are people here, there are sponsors, philanthropists, rich Sunday racers, weekend racers who will find that down the back of the sofa if you know the right people. It's quite amazing, actually. But it isn't just the money. To answer your first question, David, it isn't just the money. That is a problem, but it's not necessarily an insurmountable one. Then you have things like relationships. We're talking about 14-year-old kids, 13, 14-year-old kids, right? Is the dad going to be able to go to all the rounds with them? Can he take the time off work? Can the mum go with them? What's that relationship going to be like? Is the dad prepared to let someone else effectively take over control of his kid's career when he's managed it up to that point? We all might have an opinion on what the best route is, but then is it the best for the kid? Is it right that they go off racing at 14 years of age and they don't build, relationships with their friends at school and stuff like that? So I think it's really nuanced. I think it's really difficult. And for all of those reasons, it is a bit more easy for kids who are already in Europe and Spain. And whether or not it's possible to get to the very top without making those kind of sacrifices, I'm not sure. And that's a bit of a shame as well. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I think it's complex, and it's not, although that is an issue. And because of that, like I said, the other thing is if it doesn't happen, that route, and they do have to come back to the UK, then in the UK it is definitely a superbike route. And if you want to get to the top of that, then you're looking at World Superbike. And like I said, look at Bradley Ray. He's finally got to World Superbike, but he's on one of the least competitive packages on the grid. He's not earning great out of it, but it's an opportunity to get himself there. And he's 25, 26 years old now. In fact, he's just turned 26. So, still think of him as a young rider, but he's had to put in a decade into getting himself back to world level,
We know you've got to head back out to the island, Matt, so thanks ever so much for your time. But, as well as presenting and writing and, generally being a well-known face in sort of British road racing circles, I mean, you're also doing some stuff with coaching now. What was that motivated by? I mean, what's it all about?
Yeah, I've been kind of battling with what do I do beyond TV and racing for a few years, as you know. Because the thing with a TV job is you never quite know. Like I said, the BBC job was great, and then in 2013 they lost the rights and it all ended. And I was like, oh, luckily I got on with Eurosport. But then, sooner or later things come to an end. So I've been looking outside of racing and stuff for a while. I did a master's in sport directorship, which I just completed just like at the back end of last year. Like I said, I quite had a little bit of a role helping Shaky out with managing a couple of riders and got interested in that. And as part of that coaching thing, so I don't know if anyone is familiar with executive coaching. I wasn't before I started my master's, but we had it given to us the opportunity to be coached. And coaching really is sitting down with somebody who can listen to you, ask the right kind of questions to help you get to answers to move you forward with, whether it's a decision that you might be making about a career change or an issue that you're dealing with at home. And I was given some coaching that massively helped me over the last couple of years. And I realized that the sort of fundamentals of being a good coach, listening to somebody's story and being interested in other people and helping them, which was something that I was struggling with. I felt like in my career, I don't help anybody. Actually, it's good fun and everything, but what am I doing? What's my legacy? So I decided to do a diploma in coaching. So that's something that I'd like to do maybe on the side, with private clients, or just to integrate into my sort of daily life, really just try to help people. But I love listening to people. And really, to be honest, that's what's underpinned my career in television and writing, really. It's all about trying to tell a story, trying to listen to other people and help them tell their story. And if you think back to the Casey Stoner thing, that was my motivation to do that book, was to help him tell his story and to help other people understand that, and in a way to help him understand it too. Same with John Hopkins, that was that what I enjoyed about that whole process was going through the life story and working out how it had made them the person they are today, what their strengths are, how they can use those strengths maybe now. And and that's what coaching is about too. So actually there's quite a lot of synergy between what I've been doing before and what I'm looking to do with this in the future, but try to channel it in a positive way. That's the idea. That's the motivation.
Matt, I know you're a bit pushed for time, but just very briefly, if I'm not mistaken, you tried to interview Tom Cruise once for the BBC, and it was slightly comedic in one way. Could you maybe tell us about that?
Yeah. What year was it? Was it 05 when Valentino and Colin wore the yellow speed block Yamaha anniversary?
Laguna.
Yeah, Laguna
05, wasn't it? Yeah. And Tom Cruise was there, being the big celeb and everything. And it was quite funny because he was quite obsessed with Valentino. So he was well, that's maybe another story, but anyway, he was around a lot that weekend. And during that period, 05, was it 05? No, it was after. It can't have been 05. Anyway, it was been a couple of years after that. Yeah, because I was working for the BBC. So anyway, I'm in Parc Ferme at the end. And, when you're doing the pit lane reporter thing, you have this incredibly privileged opportunity to be the first person to speak to the riders when they get off. I tell you when it was 08, because it was Valentino versus Stoner, that big battle they had at Laguna.
The corkscrew.
Yeah, that was it. Sorry, yeah, it was that year. And so they come in and everyone's full of adrenaline and all of that. And there would be, and especially at the flyways, there would not only be myself, Paolo Beltramo from Italian TV, and Martin from Spanish TV. 3 of us in this. And you're penned off, so no one can get in there. And Tom Cruise was being led around by Manel from Dorna, and he wanted to be the first person to speak to Valentino. So Manel brought him into the little enclosure with us. So there's my team, Paolo Beltramo, me, and Tom Cruise. So my camera feed is going straight back to London to the BBC, and my director says, that Tom Cruise stood next to you? And I go, yeah, it is, yeah. He said, oh, you've got to try and get a word with him for the BBC. So I said, okay. So I looked at Manel and I said, is it okay if I, and Manel goes, yeah, go for it. Manel's a managing director at Dorna, obviously you guys know, but for anybody who doesn't. And so I said, oh, excuse me, Tom, my name's Matt from the BBC. And he's big smile, big handshake. He's like, oh, yeah, nice to meet you. And I said, is it okay if I just get a quick word for the BBC? And he says, he's nodding and smiling. And he said, no, I don't want to do that, but thank you so much for asking. So that on screen, all anybody saw, because nobody heard it, was him smiling and nodding at me. But actually, he was basically telling me to get lost.
Do one.
Yeah. God, we don't want to tell you to do one, but we know you're getting picked up and you got to get out. So, listen, thanks ever so much again for your time for joining us on the podcast. We hope we'll see you at Red Bull Ring. I mean, you'll be doing the circuit commentary again this year. I mean, what's that, 3 or 4 years in a row now? You've been actually talking to a bunch of lederhosen wearing Austrians in Spielberg.
An Austrian for the weekend every year since 16, actually, mate. Yeah, time's moving on. It's apart from COVID, this would be like 7 years, isn't it? So. Yeah, I'll be there. I'll see you for some decent free media centre food. It's the only reason I go.
Yeah, best media centre in the championship. Still up there. So, cheers again, Matt. Good luck on the island. Hope everything goes well.
Cheers, Neil. Cheers, David. Take care, guys.